They wrote rules with your name in the margins, so you would learn your place before the first piece ever moved. They rehearsed the referee voice, the benevolent smirk, the velvet threat that sounds like guidance. They built the board on a table they owned and told you the height was tradition. They cataloged your tells and choreographed your compliance. Your victories were to be curated into ornaments for their mythology. You were invited to participate, only so your effort could be taxed into their glory. Everyone cheered when you played the moves they predicted, because prediction feels like power to those who mistake choreography for destiny. Then you did what their handbook said was impossible. You reached into the quiet part of yourself, where permission has no jurisdiction, and you set down a move that did not belong to their language. No crescendo, no warning, only inevitability disguised as grace. Their smiles faltered the second they realized you were not breaking a rule. You were breaking the need for rules. That is when the wood beneath the board began to hum, not from anger, from freedom. They had a plan for your anger. They had a leash for your success. They had a script for your apology. They had a pity speech ready for the day you finally cracked. Their plan did not include your refusal to play at all. You did not argue about the unfair edges. You did not demand a fairer die. You withdrew consent from the theater. It turns out the engine of their machine was never their strategy. It was your participation. Once you stopped providing friction for them to polish into narrative, their gear spun against air. Sound without traction. Heat without motion. They threw more noise into the room, as if volume might substitute for structure. You breathed like a metronome and watched gravity reassign loyalties. They were always addicted to your reaction. You starved their addiction with dignity. That was the forbidden move, not revenge, removal. They taught you to believe that escape equals surrender. That leaving the arena confirmed the lie that you could not compete. You learned a truer thing in the long corridors of solitude, where truth does not need applause. There are games that do not deserve a winner. There are boards that rot whoever stands on them too long. Walking away was not avoidance. It was surgery. You drew a clean circle around your energy, and the room mistook it for emptiness, until they reached for you and touched a perimeter they could not cross. Boundaries look like betrayal to those who feed on access. They called you cold. You called yourself coherent. Their outrage could not breach the silence. When silence has been earned by fire, it becomes a fortress that does not require walls. They were prepared to punish rebellion that shouted. They were helpless against strategy that exhaled. You did not slam doors, you erased hinges. You did not burn bridges. You built a coast and let the tide retire what could not float. This was not spectacle. This was geometry. You removed angles they depended on. Their leverage evaporated because you no longer offered surfaces for it to grip. The clever ones felt it first. A slippage in their favorite story. A soft panic where certainty used to sit. They tried to reset you with nostalgia and ghosted favors. They tried to barter approval, their currency of choice. But approval cannot purchase someone who remembered the price and paid it in full. You carried your peace like contraband and smuggled it past every checkpoint. They controlled the room through rhythm, interruptions, timed laughs, manufactured consensus. Your move altered tempo. You refused to rush your breath to match their drum. You spoke in sentences that ended without needing permission. You paused long enough for their narrative to reveal its scaffolding. Their empire was a stage set wobbling on hidden wheels. Your stillness widened the audience's eyes until the props looked like props again. There is a violence in clarity that never raises a hand. It simply removes fog. Once fog is gone, monsters look like costumes and kings look like men who audition too hard. You did not attack their power. You clarified it, which is the same as dissolving it. They anticipated a war of opinions and brought armies of reasons. You brought evidence of alignment. People feel alignment before they agree with it. When you entered, temperature changed. You did not court belief. You embodied consequence. That makes debate irrelevant. Debate thrives where doubt is for sale. You exited the marketplace and opened a window. Fresh air is a cruel teacher for those who sold smoke. They claimed your move was luck. Then luck kept repeating with suspicious precision. Precision that arrived without fireworks. precision that tasted like inevitability. People began to adjust their chairs toward you without asking permission from their fear. They believed control lives in owning the rule book. You learned control lives in owning your nervous system. You trained to keep your pulse while the room dramatized collapse. You did not adopt their urgency. You let it pass and watched their stories exhaust themselves. Panic cannot multiply in a body that does not host it. They assumed escalation would drag you down to their floor. You answered with altitude, not superiority, oxygen. You made decisions from a height where their threats ran out of breath. The view changed everything. Patterns appeared. Loops announced themselves. The trap looked like a circle you could step over. And you did, with a softness that insulted their investment in drama. They whisper that you broke faith, that you refused community. The truth is less theatrical. You refused choreography designed to keep you spinning while they harvest the friction. You have always been generous. You simply learned the difference between feeding and being eaten. Your generosity turned toward craft, toward patience, toward the long road where progress is too quiet to perform. They cannot follow there. Loud feet tire quickly. You discovered how to let time compound on your behalf. Results began arriving disguised as ordinary days stacking like bricks. Then one morning the wall existed. They called it sudden. You called it inevitable. They armed themselves with reputation and leaned hard on the illusion that image can replace gravity. You worked in the basement where nobody claps. You poured the slow concrete of habits that carry their own weather. That kind of construction offends people who built skylines out of mirrors. They attempted to smear. They threw paint and waited for stains. Paint does not adhere to rain. You outgrew the surface that gossip needs to grip. When they said your name, it echoed against a presence too dense to puncture. The room learned without being instructed that density defeats decoration. From that day on, your quiet weighed more than their noise. They filed complaints to the gods of fairness. They wanted consequence measured in spectacle, so they could boo and feel righteous. The universe ignored them and answered your discipline with something ruder than justice. Momentum. Momentum does not apologize for who fails to keep up. It rewards the one who kept moving when movement looked like nothing. They called it cruelty when your fruits arrived. You called it accounting. Every late hour, every refined no, every decision to leave when staying would have fed your ego but starved your soul. The ledger balanced and the board tilted. Gravity rediscovered its allegiance. They will tell a new story about you to save face. They will call you lucky or ruthless or chosen. You will not argue. Arguing steals oxygen from the next ascent. Let them narrate to each other. Meanwhile, you keep the vow that dethroned their game. You will never again play for trophies handed out by gatekeepers who fear gates that open inward. You will seek compression rather than applause. You will choose distance over drama. You will treat clarity as a blade and cut yourself free before anyone else is allowed to. The forbidden move will remain your native language, not rebellion for its own sake, reinvention for its own survival. And when the next table insists you are not allowed to move that way, you will smile with the patience of storms. Then you will place the piece where they said it could not go. The room will sway again. Boards will creak. The scaffolding will confess its age. You will walk out before the collapse, unhurried, unafraid, uninterested in the ceremony of being proven right. You did not come to win their game. You came to retire it. They smiled when they handed you the rule book, as if giving you the keys to the kingdom. In truth, it was the blueprint of a prison. Every line disguised as guidance, every clause presented as tradition, every exception already owned by someone else. They made the language heavy, so you would tire before questioning it. The ink wasn't just instructions, it was permission. Subtle reminders of where you were allowed to stand, how far you could reach, and which walls you were never to touch. You thought the game was about skill. It was about obedience. They did not care if you won inside the cage, because the cage itself was the victory they sought. Their brilliance was never in their power. It was in their ability to make you forget the bars existed. Until one day you looked up and saw the pattern. Not the pattern of the game, the pattern of your confinement. They trained you to believe the cage was protection. They told you the world outside was chaos and cruelty, and that inside these rules you would find safety. What they meant was control. They wanted you docile, predictable, easy to read, easy to contain. Safety was their currency to buy your compliance. They feared the day you would notice that safety without freedom is a softer form of slavery, so they made the cage beautiful. They painted it with titles, applause, and temporary comfort. They made the floor feel stable, the roof feel sheltering, the bars feel decorative. You lived inside a masterpiece of manipulation. And then one day the beauty rotted, the gold peeled, the applause sounded hollow, the comfort began to itch, and you realized you were not surviving in here, you were shrinking. The rules were designed to keep your ambition folded small enough to fit their frame. They feared what would happen if you were allowed to stretch to full height. So they built ceilings and told you they were clouds. They made boundaries look like opportunities, disguising limits as milestones. You mistook their trophies for freedom, not realizing they were badges of containment. Their rewards were engineered to keep you chasing, to keep you performing for the audience they owned. They let you win, sometimes, but only in ways that reminded you who gave you permission to. Your victories were designed to reinforce their authority, not your independence. And once you saw that truth, the applause began to sound like chains. The real trick was that they never needed to lock the door. They convinced you to guard it yourself. They filled your head with the fear of exile, of irrelevance, of being without their stage. They whispered that outside the rules, no one would listen, no one would care, no one would respect you. They made rebellion sound like suicide, like self-sabotage, like madness. So you stayed, even when you knew the walls, even when you knew the bars. You stayed because they taught you to mistake captivity for belonging. That was their art. They never needed force when they could program obedience. The cage was not made of steel, it was made of belief. And belief is the most dangerous prison, because you can walk out any time. If you are willing to abandon the version of yourself that was built to survive in here. That was the cost they never told you about. Leaving meant killing the self they had shaped. It meant learning to breathe without their oxygen. It meant learning to live without their validation. And most people, when faced with that choice, go back inside willingly. That is why their system thrives. Not because it is strong, because it is comfortable. You learn that rules are only real if you agree to them. That a cage can dissolve the second you refuse to acknowledge it as yours. But refusal is a dangerous thing in a room full of people who have agreed to the bars. The moment you stand, the others will call you reckless. They will call you arrogant. They will warn you of the dangers beyond. They will call you selfish for leaving them behind. They will cling to your ankles to keep you in their safety. That is when you must remember. Your escape will be seen as betrayal only by those still enslaved. They underestimated your patience. You did not rush to break the cage. You studied it. You learned every seam, every weld, every weakness in the architecture of their control. You waited until your exit would not be reaction, but precision. And when you moved, it was not with noise, but with inevitability. They expected a riot, a rebellion, something they could label as chaos to discredit you. Instead, you walked out quietly, leaving the door open behind you, and the silence you left inside was deafening. Once outside, you discovered the thing they never wanted you to see. There was no chaos. There was no collapse. There was only space. Space to grow into the size you were meant to be. Space to create rules that served you instead of caging you. Space to breathe without asking permission. And once you tasted it, you understood why they feared your escape so deeply. Because freedom is contagious. It makes others question their bars. And questioning is the first crack in any prison. Now you do not fight their rules. You do not even acknowledge them. You exist beyond their jurisdiction. They can shout from their cage about honor, about loyalty, about betrayal, but their words cannot touch you. You are not playing their game. You are building your own field. And in time, those who once guarded the bars will watch their own cages rust, while yours expands into an empire without walls. That is the final insult to their design. That the rules they built to cage you became the proof how small they were willing to think. They had rehearsed the scene in their minds for years. You were meant to follow their cues, deliver your lines, and exit when told. Every interaction was written for you before it even happened. Your tone was calculated. Your role was fixed. The brilliance of their control was that it didn't feel like control. It felt like structure, order, something that kept you safe from chaos. But their entire performance depended on one critical thing, that you would never notice the walls of the stage. The moment you stopped playing by their script, the first thread came loose. It didn't snap violently. It unraveled quietly, almost invisibly. They didn't notice at first, because collapse rarely begins with a bang. It starts with a shift in the air, a change in rhythm. You stopped delivering the lines they wrote, and suddenly the scene felt wrong to them, though they could not explain why. They had built their power on predictability. Their authority thrived in the certainty of your compliance. Every move you made was a cue for the next act. Every reaction you gave was the confirmation they needed to continue the performance. When you began to withhold those cues, their machinery stuttered. They were still speaking, still moving, still gesturing, but there was no response from you to anchor their direction. The silence you offered wasn't absence, it was sabotage. It stripped their script of meaning. Without your cooperation, their narrative began to feel hollow. They repeated their lines louder, mistaking volume for impact, but it only exposed the desperation under their voice. You didn't storm off the stage. That would have given them the satisfaction of calling you volatile. You stayed in your position, but denied them the energy they required to keep the act alive. Every smile you refused to fake, every word you chose not to speak, every performance you left unfinished. It was a dismantling far more effective than open defiance. They could not punish you without proving their dependence on you. They could not rewrite the script fast enough to keep up with your refusal to play along. The more you broke their rhythm, the more their lines sounded rehearsed and forced to everyone watching. The beauty of your move was that it worked in layers. On the surface, you appeared calm, unbothered, even disengaged. Beneath that stillness was precision. You were extracting the oxygen from their fire, not with confrontation, but with withdrawal. They tried to provoke you, to lure you back into the game where they were comfortable. They dangled bait disguised as challenges, hoping your ego would drag you into their trap. You didn't bite. You let them swing into the air, hitting nothing. And each time they missed, their confidence cracked a little more. You knew that their collapse wouldn't happen in one dramatic moment. It would happen in whispers, in tiny humiliations that compounded over time. The audience would begin to see the strain on their face, the way their lines no longer matched the energy of the room. They would notice how your absence from their narrative left a gap too large to ignore. People would ask questions. Subtle ones at first, then sharper ones. Doubt would spread like a shadow, and it would not stop until it reached the core of their image. And you didn't need to answer those questions. Your silence would do the work. By removing yourself from their script, you forced them into improvisation. And here's the thing about people who rely on control. They cannot improvise without revealing their weaknesses. Every unscripted moment became a confession. They stuttered where they once spoke with certainty. They hesitated where they once moved with confidence. And when they tried to cover their mistakes, they only drew more attention to them. They could not admit the real problem, that their entire structure depended on your cooperation. You didn't need to destroy them. You only needed to stop feeding them. When they no longer had your energy to fuel their machine, the gears began to grind against each other. Missteps became visible. Fractures became obvious. Allies who once applauded them began to pull away. And when enough people left, the stage that once looked grand became an empty, echoing room. Their voice, once commanding, became just another sound swallowed by the silence you had mastered. What they didn't understand was that your choice was not rebellion. It was evolution. You outgrew their performance. You outgrew the need for their approval, their stage, their applause. The moment you stopped performing for them was the moment you reclaimed your freedom. And in reclaiming it, you showed the audience that their authority had always been fragile. that the structure they worshipped was only standing because you played along. Their collapse was inevitable, but your timing ensured it was irreversible. You allowed them enough rope to believe they were still in control, even as they tied the noose with their own hands. You never had to pull it tight. They did that themselves, struggling to keep their narrative alive without realizing they were strangling it. All you did was stand there, watching as their empire shrank into the same small box they once tried to keep you in. They were addicted to the scoreboard. Every exchange, every interaction, was measured in points only they believed in. They called it winning when they embarrassed someone publicly. They called it winning when they manipulated a reaction out of you. They called it winning when the room laughed at their joke. Even if the laughter was nervous and thin, the scoreboard was their religion, and they worshipped it without ever questioning if the numbers meant anything. You didn't challenge their religion. You didn't walk in and shatter their altar. You simply stopped playing the game. And when you stepped out of their constructed arena, they kept looking for your name on the board. That was when the panic started, because without you, the scoreboard didn't feel like victory. It felt like an echo. They thought they were hunters, moving through the forest with precision, always 3 steps ahead. But their hunt only existed because you allowed them to believe you were prey. When you stopped running, when you stopped making noise, when you simply stood there and looked at them, the reality hit them like a slow, creeping dawn. This was never a hunt. It was a performance for themselves. They weren't predators. They were actors in a play you had been quietly directing. And in that still moment, they understood they hadn't been winning ground. They had been circling the same clearing over and over, mistaking motion for progress. You didn't need to sabotage them. Their entire game was built on the illusion of competition. They believed that every word they threw at you was a blow, every rumor a strike, every subtle dig a step closer to victory. What they never realized was that you were not even on the same battlefield. Your war wasn't fought in whispers or side glances. It was fought in the architecture of your life, in the silent construction of something that could not be taken from you. They were so focused on knocking over your pieces that they never noticed you had built a second board they could not touch. The beauty of it was that you didn't have to prove them wrong. You didn't need to hold up a mirror and demand they look. The truth arrived on its own, in the quiet moments between their moves. They would lie awake at night, replaying conversations, looking for signs they had landed the final blow, only to find nothing but the hollow sound of their own voice. They began to see that your lack of retaliation was not weakness. It was absence. You were not absorbing their attacks. You were not even in range of them. They weren't beating you. They were shadowboxing. The cracks didn't appear in their strategy all at once. They arrived in whispers, the missed opportunities, the lukewarm laughter, the allies who didn't clap as loudly anymore. It was the subtle shift in the air when they entered a room and realized they were not the axis of the conversation. It was the realization that people no longer leaned in when they spoke, that the weight they once carried had begun to feel lighter, almost disposable. Victory had always been defined by attention, and without yours, it tasted stale. You never needed to make a move to end them. Your greatest advantage was letting them run out of road. They sprinted so hard in the direction of a win that didn't exist that by the time they realized the landscape had changed, they were exhausted, dehydrated, and standing in a place where no one was watching. The applause they thought they were earning had been gone for a long time. They just hadn't noticed until the silence was deafening. They began to remember moments differently. The story they had told themselves about your defeats started to feel flimsy. They replayed the times they thought they had cornered you, only to realize you had slipped away before the trap had even closed. They remembered the debates where they believed they had the last word, but now the memory stung because they could hear the quiet confidence in your voice, the kind that didn't need to win to be certain. The cruel truth was that you didn't take their victories from them. You simply let them see what they really were, self-awarded medals for imaginary battles. And once a person sees the emptiness of their own trophies, they can never hold them with pride again. Every time they look at what they thought was proof of their superiority, they will feel the weight of its hollowness. That's not something you can unsee. Your silence became a mirror that reflected their effort back to them, stripped of meaning. They had been running a race where the finish line kept moving, and you had been the one quietly holding the rope. When you let go, they kept running, only to realize there was no tape to break, no crowd to cheer, no record to shatter. Just the long, lonely track and the sound of their own footsteps.